Outcasts and fugitives, hooded eyes and weary brows, seek refuge in the night. They are the scatterings of Africa, each uprooted one, on the road to Benatar, where the world began. I love the scatterings of Africa, each and every one. In their hearts a burning hunger, beneath the copper sun. Ancient bones from old divide, echoes of the very first cry. Who made you here and why? Beneath the copper sun. African idea, African idea. Make the future clear, make the future clear. And we are scatterings of Africa, both human die. We run the road to Benatar, beneath the copper sky. And we are scatterings of Africa, journey to the sky. Far below we live forever, dreams of what we were.
Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to those of you who join us online and to the small party that gathers here on the campus, to Marina and Jock Deacon, to Associate Professor Tracy Naledi, the Deputy Dean for Health Services, and to Professor and Mrs. Benatar, who join us this afternoon for this lecture here in a room on the faculty. I think as I listen to that Juluga song, I think all of us have a sense of evoking memory and the stories that we tell of so long ago. But it also evokes for us a deep sense of connectedness, and in the spirit that we often speak of in isiZulu, the idea that umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. Each of us is a person because of other people. And lectures such as this often evoke that sense for me. Because every time a university names a lecture after an individual, we speak deeply into our history and the legends our history is filled with. Because we're often honoring the tales of great discovery and scholarship. But lectures such as this allow us an occasion to look forward. And often in those we invite to address us on these occasions, the speakers offer us insights of what has been, but they will offer us often a vision of how things could be, where we might go, and the new paths we might take as we continue this quest to build a future in which all are welcome from the margins of our society into the heart of who we are and what we are to do in this world. This Faculty of Health Sciences will be 110 years next year. And even as we reflect on so many of our legends who have gone before us, we reflect on our place at this time in the world, a faculty that is foremost on the African continent, which ranks amongst the top 10 in the world for infectious diseases, and continues to produce research that keeps it ranked very highly across the globe. But we recognize in these moments too that this faculty is renowned for its leadership in education of the health professions of our country. We're a faculty that has produced in this year more than 300 postgraduate students who have qualified, and more than 250 undergraduate professionals will leave the university this week following their oath-taking ceremony tomorrow. But we're also a faculty who, together with our partners in the Western Cape government, have countered the pandemic and managed it in a way that has been exemplary for people across the globe. But in this place of stars, we acknowledge the guidance of our ancestors, and in some traditions, the stars are a reflection of the ancestors who've gone before us. And today we honor one such ancestor, Marinus van den Ende. And we are grateful today for their contribution to our story, because in many ways, his story is now a part of our story. These stories are inseparably woven together. Convergence is the name the first Khoi people gave to this place that is now called Observatory, the place where this faculty is in Cape Town. And the meaning of that name is the place of the stars. And in this place of the stars, we listen carefully to the voices of our ancestors. We reflect on what we hear from them, what we hear them say, and we build on those legacies to continue to create a world of compassion, a world of humility, and a world of justice, in which all people are increasingly able to fulfill their true human potential. Today, we warmly welcome, both through an electronic space as well as into this physical space, into this place of the stars, Convergence, the descendants of the late Professor Marinus van den Ende. In the room here, we have Marina Deacon, his daughter, and her husband, Jock. But online, we have Jan, Joan, and Piet, together with many of their children, so the next generation of the van den Ende family. This lecture today, this 2021 edition of the van den Ende lecture, is the final offering in this form. The van den Ende family have requested that the endowment which supported this lecture be converted into a bursary, and you'll hear more of that a little bit later. But this lecture honors the memory of Marinus van den Ende. After matriculating at the age of 15, Marinus van den Ende studied medicine at UCT, graduating in MBCHB in 1933, with distinctions in anatomy, physiology, psychiatry, and surgery. In 1935, he joined the pathology department here at the UCT Medical School then as a junior assistant under Professor Professor B. Ryrie. He then followed in the footsteps of Florey, of penicillin fame, as the second recipient of a John Lucas Walker Scholarship. He studied at Cambridge University and is awarded a PhD in pathology in 1940. At Cambridge, his encounters with Sir Henry Dale, director of British MRC's National Institute for Medical Research, became a turning point of his career. In 1939, shortly before the declaration of World War II, Marinus married Joan Barry, whom he had met when she was a BSc graduate, working as a lab assistant in bacteriology. In 1946, he became chair of bacteriology in UCT's medical school, and in 1947, became head of the combined departments of pathology, bacteriology, and chemical pathology. Reorganization of the Department of Pathology towards a virological emphasis and creation in 1948 of the CSIR Virus Research Unit under his directorship set the scene for his ongoing work and contribution to the global body of scholarship. He was a highly respected teacher, speaker, and competent administrator. His research success was particularly remarkable, as he worked in relative isolation here in Cape Town, with little opportunity to interact with other distant experts globally. In 1953, as recipient of the Arthur Sims Traveling Fellowship, he spent several months working on recombinant influenza viruses in Macfarlane Burnet's laboratories at the renowned Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. In that year, he became Dean of Medicine and was awarded a University of Cape Town Fellowship. A year later, he was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of South Africa. He was also the first recipient of the SAMA, South African Medical Association in those days, a silver medal. In 1957, while acting principal of the university, he died at the young age of 45. We honor such an ancestor today. But colleagues, friends, family, in this place of the stars today, we are invited to listen to Emeritus Solly Benatar as he delivers the 2021 Van den Ende Memorial Lecture. Solomon Benatar, or Solly as he is affectionately known, is an Emeritus Professor of Medicine and Senior Research Scholar here at the University of Cape Town. He was Professor and Head of the UCT GSH Groote Hospital Department of Medicine from 1980 to 1999, and was a founding director of the UCT Bioethics Center from 1992 to 2012. He was an annually invited visiting scholar and teacher at the University of Toronto from 2000 to 2019, an invited speaker at many institutions globally, and visiting professor in social medicine at Harvard University in 1994 and 1995. It's been an interesting afternoon with Professor Benatar talking about the places he has been able to come to and those he hasn't been able to come to in the last 2 years. UCT went on to award him a DSc Medicine, a Doctor of Science in Medicine by examination in 2007. And colleagues, this is the senior doctoral award in the faculty, which is given to somebody who is post-doctoral study already. He is an elected foreign member of the United States National Academy of Medicine, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a Fellow of the Royal Society of South Africa, and the Faculty of Medicine, Imperial College London. He was a founder member of the Academy of Sciences of South Africa. His major international awards were the 2011 Henry Knowles Beecher Award from the Hastings Center in New York and the 2015 Global Forum for Bioethics Research Award. It is a singular honor for me to this afternoon invite Emeritus Professor Solly Benatar to deliver the 2021 Van den Ende Memorial Lecture, which he has entitled The Confluence of Catastrophes, COVID-19 and Climate Change. Welcome, Professor Benatar.
Good afternoon, everybody, those in the room and those who are attending virtually. And thank you very much to the Dean and the Faculty of Medicine for inviting me to give this lecture, and of course to the family who were also involved with selecting me for this special occasion. I'm delighted to be able to do so, and it's an honor. Today is a historic occasion, being the last of many lectures in memory of Marinus van den Ende. I've known his son Jan and his late mother Joan since the mid-1960s, and have held them both in high esteem and affection. In the same high esteem and affection that we are according to Marinus van den Ende today. Joan was a very special lady, and I'm privileged to be giving this final lecture with her daughter Marina in the room with me today and her husband Jock. I've chosen to speak on a topic that I think her father would have approved. I had intended to begin with brief reference to Marinus's life and career, but the Dean has already graciously done so, so I won't repeat anything that he has said. On another personal note, however, I want to refer to Marinus van den Ende's death in 1957 at the young age of 45 from a disease that was not treatable then but he is treatable today. I was 15 in 1957, the year he died, and developed a disease that was treatable. And together with the complications which came later and were also treatable, I've had the privilege of surviving into old age. These different fates resonate deeply with me. Now, I want to begin this lecture with a slide that I fortuitously picked up of a poster at the recent COP26 meeting in Glasgow. What it shows here is the rise of the pandemic, the rise in interest and concern about climate change, the conflict that is associated with both of these and many other aspects of the world in which we live, and the global economy, which was on the rise before all of this happened, and that's of important value as will become available in my lecture, and the puzzlement of those of us who are, living in this world and understanding that these disasters or catastrophes are collaborating better than we are. We can learn something from how to collaborate better into the future. This context that we're living in has been called a global planetary organic crisis by some of us who've been working on these issues for the last 25 or 30 years. And what I want to do today is I want to unpack that crisis for you so that you can see where we come from and where we might be going. But let me begin by pointing out that until a few years ago, there was enormous satisfaction with the improvements that we'd made in global health in the preceding 100 years or so. And indeed, there's much to be proud of in terms of what we've achieved. I can't show all of that today, but let me show you something briefly. On the top left-hand corner, you'll see the deaths of children under the age of 5 around the world. And you'll see that that's diminished. But you'll also see that in sub-Saharan Africa, it's remained pretty static and hasn't diminished very much. At the bottom of the graph, we have hunger in the world. And much is made of the fact that hunger is also reduced in the world, but has been reduced predominantly in China and in India. And again, when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, hunger remains rife and a major problem. And sadly, we see it in the streets around us every day. In the 60s and 70s, the hope was that we might have conquered infectious diseases. But then new infectious diseases began to arise, and the one that's affected us most severely is HIV/AIDS. And on the top right of this slide, you'll see the rise in death from HIV/AIDS until such time as antiretroviral therapy became available, since when the deaths have diminished and will hopefully go down to a very low or zero level in due course. Another chronic illness that's plagued us all is malaria. And at the bottom of the graph, you'll see the reduction in malaria around the world, but you'll see that malaria remains a problem again in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the recent announcement of a malaria vaccine offers wonderful prospects for the future and gives us an idea again of what science might offer in terms of the changes it can make to the future. On this next graph, I've shown at the top left-hand corner the vaccines that have been produced during the course of the last century. Many, many vaccines that have saved millions of lives, and in particular, the smallpox vaccine. And it's important to note that smallpox killed between 300 and 500 million people before it was finally brought under control in 1977. And now we have the COVID vaccines produced by brilliant scientists in a short time, to whom we must be enormously grateful and look to for hope for future vaccines that we're going to need. If we look at polio, at the bottom of the curve, at the bottom of the graph, we've almost eliminated polio completely, which is wonderful. Now, on the right-hand side of the slide, I want to draw your attention to life expectancy at birth for the world and for different regions. And this is for the period 1950 to 2010. And you'll see that life expectancy along all of those lines, the top line represents the most developed and wealthy regions of the world, and the bottom represents the poorest country in the world, Africa. And you'll see that there's been an increase in life expectancy at birth for all population groups. But note in particular that that's not something to be so proud of when there are such marked disparities that still exist. Disparities between the poorest and the richest that I want to dwell on a little bit more, because they are of crucial significance to the COVID pandemic and what might lie ahead. This slide shows you life expectancy versus per capita income. And on the slide, each circle represents a country, and you can see some countries are named. And the size of the circle represents the size of the population of that country. The bottom of the graph shows the income, and on the left you see life expectancy at birth. Now let me draw your attention to a few things on the slide. The first is that there's a sort of linear relationship. The wealthier a country is, the longer the life expectancy in that country. But for any level of wealth, you'll see that there's a variation in life expectancy. So for example, South Africa is of similar per capita GDP as Indonesia and China and Brazil, yet those other countries have a much longer life expectancy than we have. Similarly, if you look at all the African countries, and they are in blue on this graph, and you look at South Africa, and you look at countries to the left of South Africa, you'll see that there are countries much poorer than us that manage to achieve the same life expectancy at birth. So there is a relationship between health and life expectancy and human well-being, but it's not a linear relationship. It's much more complicated than that. And hopefully some of those features will come out during this presentation. What I think we're facing at the time of the COVID pandemic descending upon us is what I and my colleagues have called a crisis in healthcare. A crisis that relates firstly to the wide disparities in health that I've shown you very briefly. There are many other statistics that I could show you, but I won't have time for that today. The other is the changing burden of disease. There's been a big shift towards chronic diseases and non-communicable diseases, also an aging population, which makes it much more difficult to handle medical cases. And most particularly, our healthcare systems face major challenges. There isn't a healthcare system anywhere in the world that doesn't have one of these three characteristics that I've listed here. They are all distorted, they are dysfunctional, and they are unsustainable. And I'll briefly indicate why. They're distorted because there is no health system that is designed to be able to cope with the particular burden of disease of the country in which the health system is based. Healthcare systems have developed in a haphazard way, and they do deal with the diseases in their own country, but not in a way that's well organized. They're dysfunctional because over time, institutions that are supposed to be delivering healthcare are more and more affected by the commercialization of medicine, by the bureaucrats who occupy the roles of managing the commerce. And indeed, in the USA at the moment, there are 9 bureaucrats for every doctor within the healthcare system. So those impacts on the healthcare system make the healthcare system in many ways dysfunctional. It becomes very difficult for doctors to do the work and healthcare workers to do the work they want to do. And the healthcare system's unsustainable because the demand exceeds the supply, and we haven't got around to thinking and applying our minds to how we set priorities and allocate resources in a way that would allow our health systems to be sustainable. So those are all the issues that are associated with the crisis in healthcare. And let me just show you one slide here in relationship to the distortion of the healthcare systems. On the left-hand side, you'll see the disability adjusted life years, which is a measure of the burden of disease in countries around the world. And you'll see that the Central African Republic, Lesotho, Sierra Leone, and other countries in the global south are on the left-hand side of that curve with a very high burden of disease. The bottom of the graph, we see the health expenditure per capita in US dollars. And you'll see the health expenditure on the poor suffering the highest burden of disease is minimal. Whereas as you move along the graph to Japan and Canada and Germany and North America, you'll see vast expenditure per capita on health for a low burden of disease. So these distortions in healthcare across the world make it extraordinarily difficult to achieve anything like the kind of equity that one would like to have. And of course, these differences that we see across countries also exist within countries. Now, let's move to the COVID pandemic. And the graph that I'm showing here of the increase in the number of cases is dated the 4th of August. So at the 4th of August, there were 200 million cases that had been recorded in the world. But on the left, you'll see some latest data from the 6th of December. We're up to 265 million with over 5 million deaths and a total number of 8 billion doses of vaccines that have been given. But of course, the total coverage with the vaccine is very different across different countries. Now, the COVID pandemic is not new and it's not unexpected. There are many of us who've been working in this field who for years have predicted that there will soon be another pandemic. And if you look at this map here, it shows you what I call the biological crisis. the crisis of newly emerging diseases, which are in red, and COVID and HIV are amongst those, and many of the other viral diseases we've seen in recent years. Indeed, since 1970s, there have been more than 40 new diseases that have emerged. In the blue, we have the re-emerging or resurging diseases. These are like tuberculosis and malaria that have become multi-drug resistant, and other diseases which have resurged, which still plague us despite the fact that we thought that we might have been able to manage them. And now we have also the deliberately emerging diseases. And on this graph, we only have anthrax, which has been used as a biological weapon and might portend what the future lies in terms of the role of microbes in our lives. And again, this is not new, as I've indicated. Many of us have long been concerned about the emergence of a new pandemic. And in 1994, Laurie Garrett wrote this book called The Coming Plague, where she described the history of infectious diseases in the world and the reasons why they emerged and what would be likely to happen in the future. And so what we're seeing today is not new and not unexpected, but we are unprepared because we couldn't see the wood for the trees. And despite an enormous amount of pandemic planning that took place at the World Health Organization and elsewhere, when the pandemic came, we were not prepared. So I come back to the term that I use, the global planetary organic crisis. And we've coined that term because A, it's global, it involves the whole world. B, it's planetary because it involves the health of the Earth, of our planet itself. And it's organic in the sense that none of these are occurring in isolation. They're occurring in a complex interactive system with positive and negative feedback loops that emphasize and accentuate different aspects of each of the pandemics. Now, I could talk for a long time about the sociological crisis as one of the components, but I'm not going to. I've mentioned the egregious disparities in health and wealth and the crisis of the healthcare systems. But the background against which that is occurring is also an unstable situation of geopolitical power relations, an enormous amount of anger and conflict in the world, and the possibility of more wars, even nuclear war on the horizon, and displacement and migration of people as a result of that conflict, which has resulted in there being 71 million displaced people today, and a prediction of probably a minimum of 200 million by the year 2050. And of course, that will impose an enormous burden on healthcare systems and on countries around the world. With regard to the biological crisis, I've mentioned the infectious diseases, but we also need to remember that there's rising antimicrobial resistance. And it's a big battle to keep up with that and to control that. So, for example, in South Africa, we have multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And although they only comprise a small proportion of all patients with TB, they consume the majority of the TB budget because those drugs are so expensive. So antimicrobial resistance is a problem. And then we have the ecologic and the environmental crisis that I'm going to turn to. And finally, I'm going to turn to the economic crisis, because the economic crisis, in many ways, lies behind the other crises. In fact, it could be the single most important causal and perpetuating factor. Right. Now, that too is not new. Johan Galtung, who's a Norwegian sociologist, in 1980 already wrote in a book called The True Worlds, a very lengthy book about many of these issues. He wrote that there are many crises in the world today, at the root of which is structural violence. And what he meant by that is that the violence of the world that we live in is built into the way the world works. It's not random, it's not just planned in a serial manner. The world is structured in a way that creates violent circumstances for many people in different ways. So let's turn to the ecological crisis. And again, our major focus is on climate change. That's what really hits us in the face, because those are the features that we see in the media every day. But what we don't see and what we don't necessarily know about and don't necessarily think about are the other components of the ecological crisis: the land degradation, which is extensive and is important in terms of food production; water insecurity, which we've already faced in Cape Town and which we're seeing in other parts of the country and which will become a global problem; intensive animal farming and cruelty to animals that causes an enormous amount of greenhouse gases that could be avoided; deforestation, extinction of species, degradation of seas and lakes, pollution, all of which contribute to creating new ecological niches where infectious diseases can emerge and spread from animals to humans and cause the kind of plague that we're facing today. Let me just point out that air pollution on its own, that people don't think about too much, caused 7 million deaths in 2017. and it causes about 7 million deaths a year. And that's 3 times as many as the deaths from TB, malaria, and HIV combined. So that form of pollution, and pollution is rife, everything on Earth is polluted, causes an enormous amount of human ill health. And we've neglected these issues again for a long time, in the same way as we've neglected the idea that new infectious diseases will emerge. And the neglect goes back at least to Rachel Carson, who in 1962 wrote The Silent Spring. And 50 years later, 10 years ago, a 50th anniversary edition was also published. And also there's been denial about climate change. And the one I find most surprising is this quote I came across a few days ago from an American senator who in 2003 said that global warming is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. Can you imagine that there are people who really believed that then and who still believe that today? Let me show you something about the ecological issues and in fact energy consumption and the crisis that relates to energy consumption. This is the size of the world population. I should have taken that off, apologies. This is the size of the world population over the last 12,000 years since the end of the last ice age and the beginning of the agricultural revolution. And you'll see that population was static for many, many years and only began to rise a few hundred years ago, and since then has risen exponentially. If we look at the graph of energy use, you'll see that they mirror each other. And in fact, the exponential increase in the use of energy has been associated with an increase in the population and an increase in consumption. I don't know if you can see it clearly on that graph, but beginning with coal and oil and gas, and then moving to nuclear, and now we're moving to renewable forms of energy, which are the hope for the future. But you'll see at the moment that they comprise a very small component of the total amount of energy that we use. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that this kind of exponential growth is analogous to the growth of a cancer. And what I'm showing you in this graph on the left is the measured growth of a lung cancer on a series of X-rays of a patient suffering from a lung cancer in which the doubling time of the malignant cell was 100 days. So the cell took 100 days to go from 1 to 2, from 2 to 4, from 4 to 8, etc. It takes 9 years from the first doubling to the 30 doubling. At the 30th doubling, the tumor is 1 centimeter in diameter and can be seen on the chest X-ray. You can't see it on the chest X-ray. Let's see if I can find this pointer now. Can you put it there for me? 1 centimeter in diameter at 30 doublings. Thank you. And a few more doublings and another 1.5 years and the patient's dead. So in many ways, what we're looking at, if we continue to consume energy in the way we're consuming it, is a fatal diagnosis, which is why it becomes crucial to reduce the energy that we use. And I will turn to that a little later. Let me show you some of the impacts of climate change. On the left, you'll see the rise in temperature, which is unequivocal. And it's now been well established that that is due to human activity and not due to extraneous activities. And on the right, you see a map of the world with the climate risk areas. The risk areas are in a dark blue. You'll see that most of them are coastal. You'll see that most of them are in the global south. And if you can see a very little thin line in the region of India, China, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia, you'll see that that is an area of the world that contains half the world's population. 3.5 of the 7.5 billion people live in that area. And the water shortages and the other manifestations of climate change are going to lead to radical effects in that part of the world, with many, many people wishing to migrate and leave and go to other countries, which will pose enormous problems for them and for all other countries. So the risks of climate change, although focused on the global south, are going to affect everyone everywhere. The curve at the bottom of the left of this graph shows you the emissions of carbon. And what you'll see here is that wealthiest 10% of the world's population contribute 49% of carbon dioxide emission into the atmosphere. And the bottom 50% of the world's population emit 10%. But if you look at the mortality from climate change on the bottom right, in relationship to a map of the world that's plotted according to the size of the countries depicted in terms of the mortality rate, you'll see that the mortality rate is highest in the global south. So the global footprint is dominated in the global north and also within countries in the global south, of course, but the majority of the problem is going to manifest in the global south. These are the pictures that you're familiar with from the everyday press. Massive fires, floods, pollution of seas, an enormous amount of effluent being deposited into rivers and sea every day, and then the plastic floating in the screen at the bottom right-hand side of the slide. And you'll see again that that's concentrated around India and China and Southeast Asia and Indonesia, where 50% of the world's population live. A massive problem in terms of pollution. Let me turn now to the global economic crisis, which I've suggested to you lies at the heart of our problems. This graph shows you the distribution of income in the world in 1992. And you'll see that at that time, the top 20% of the world had about 82% of the world income. And lower down, there was the distribution of the rest of that income. If we go a little further to 2007, you'll see how the distribution has changed. The world gross domestic product more than doubled during that time, but the money was funneled to the top. So the wealth remains in the top 5 or 10%, and in fact in the top 1%. And people like Thomas Piketty and others are writing about the top 0.1%. And that 0.1% issue is illustrated by the latest data from Oxfam in 2019, where they documented that 26 people held more wealth than 3.8 billion people in the world. Well, that kind of distribution of wealth in the world cannot possibly augur for the good. On the bottom graph, you'll see the distribution of income in per capita income per day between 2001 and 2011 from the Pew Research Center. And the solid line that you can see, that solid red line, represents a shift over that 10-year period. And a lot of noise has been made about how during that 10-year period, 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. But a careful look at that slide shows you that that lifting out of poverty represented an increase in per capita daily income from about 20 or 30 cents below $2 a day to 20 or 30 cents above $2 a day. Anybody who imagines that's lifting people out of poverty is looking at it in a purely technical way in terms of a definition. It bears no relationship to reality in terms of the quality of people's lives or what they can expect to be able to do. So we talk in language that doesn't always make sense, and unless one has access to data like this, it becomes a sort of feel-good situation that we've lifted billions of people out of poverty. And here we see the poor living close to the rich. That's a picture of Mumbai with the slum areas in the front and the superb other high-rise buildings elsewhere. And of course, there are many cities in the world that resemble that, Cape Town included. So the disparities are enormous. Now, why is this the case? And the suggestion is that it all relates to the global political economy, which in recent years by political scientists and global political economists has been called a market civilization. A civilization in which the market ideology pervades all aspects of life. Here are some characteristics of the market civilization. First of all, it's driven by the profit motive. Money is the bottom line. The aim is to accelerate production, to accelerate the use of energy, and to encourage people to consume. In fact, some have said, consume today and forget about tomorrow. The focus is on endless economic growth, which means the endless use of energy. And development has been equated to economic growth. The higher the GDP of a country, the more developed it's considered to be. But GDP doesn't only measure good things, it measures bad things. If you have a war, the GDP goes up and the money's been spent on fighting the war. So economic growth in itself is not a good thing. It's a question of how that growth takes place and how it's distributed. Many economists today who would never have said this 10 or 20 years ago are in full agreement with an idea expressed many years ago by John Kenneth Galbraith that the economy is fraudulent. It's a fraudulent global political economy, and it's vastly exploitative. One of the major features of the world economy is that it dispossesses communities. Private goods are valued more than public goods, and there's free riding on the environment, which has allowed the destruction of our natural resources that many others depend on without any cost to those who do so. And then, of course, we're faced with poor governance within our country, within many other countries, and certainly at a global level. The World Health Organization is not able to manage healthcare in the way that it should ideally be managed. And so there's corruption and there are power relation problems that are associated with the market civilization. Now, here are some issues that affect us all. I've indicated that market fundamentalism deepens social inequality. I've shown you that from the way the resources are channeled. But what they've also done is they've turned us from individuals who want to be respected as individuals to some who are hyper-individualistic. They think only of themselves. It's become me only. And this is a narrow moral agenda. It's driven by civil and political rights. My right to do what I want with my body or with anything else, with no consideration of the responsibilities that go with rights, or with all the social and economic and cultural rights and the many other rights, even to a clean environment that are embodied within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in a way that's supposed to be indivisible. You can't pick and choose which human rights you want from the Universal Declaration. You're supposed to go for them all. But we focus on civil and political rights, and people get angry if their own individual rights are not met. Solidarity and civic citizenship are undervalued. There's a sort of ecological myopia. There's a lack of vision as to what we're actually doing to ourselves and to the future. There's been an erosion of public health systems. And it's interesting that in the New York Times just a few days ago, there was this paper entitled, "Behind the Low Vaccination Rates Lurks a More Profound Social Weakness." And I think I've illustrated to you today what that profound social weakness is. The reason people are refusing vaccinations and claiming their own rights relates to that background that has alienated themselves from the communities in which they live. So let's turn now briefly to the determinants of health and disease. What makes us healthy and what causes us to become ill in our lives? Well, the most important factors are social factors, the conditions under which we live. And this begins for any particular person when they're in their mother's womb. The mother's nourishment, how she's treated, whether she wants that child, whether she's brutalized or looked after. What happens when the child's born? Is it loved? Is it vaccinated? Is it educated? Is it able to develop into the potential it might have for the future? And then, of course, our personal behavior. But even more important than those social factors are what are called the societal influences. The societal influences are the political economy that determines the living conditions of people and the ideology that lies behind how a particular political economy is organized. Of course, we think of the most important determinant of health being access to effective healthcare services, and that's certainly appropriate for all of us who suffered from illnesses and who want access to healthcare, who benefit enormously from that. And within a faculty of health sciences like ours, we should focus on that because that's what we do well. But we shouldn't imagine for a moment that improving access to healthcare, even if we had a national health insurance, would make all that much difference to the population health if we were to ignore the social determinants of health, which in countries other than South Africa contribute enormous amount. I'll come back to that. So then, of course, our biology and genetics and our environment. Now, a study in Canada some years ago showed that 50% of the health of the Canadian population at large was attributable to social and economic circumstances. 25% was attributable to healthcare, and the rest to the issues mentioned on that slide. And that 50% is in Canada, but there are still enormous inequities in health. In poor countries, like many countries in Africa, more than 50% of population health is determined by the social and economic circumstances. I shudder frequently when I get notices from our dean and from the university of young students and young members of staff who've died. They're dying in their 30s and their 40s and their 50s, despite the fact that they've got jobs at the university, many of them are educated, but they have a legacy of a background in terms of the social determinants of health that go into their own childhood that have predicted that they will not have a long lifespan. And so we see the impact of the social determinants extraordinarily powerfully. Now, this brings me to what's been called the Convergence Model for the emergence of infectious diseases. And this is based on a symposium held at the National Academy of Medicine, which I'm privileged to be a member of. It was held in 2003 and was very much influenced by Joseph Lederberg, who is a very famous molecular biologist who won the Nobel Prize at the age of 33 for work that he'd done on showing that microbes could exchange their genes during the reproductive process. Now, what this diagram shows is that the black issues which are the crises and the social issues that I presented around you, which now impact on the relationship between the microbe and the human. And in the middle, you'll see that square, and that square represents the features that determine the emergence of a new infectious disease. Right in the middle, the black hole, are the things we don't know. The little white penumbra around the black hole are the increasingly understood factors that determine the emergence of infectious diseases. And they relate to the microbes' adaptation and evolutionary changes, and to the human susceptibility to disease and our understanding of that, for example, with HIV/AIDS. But all the others, the physical and environmental factors and the social and political factors and the ecological factors, relate to changing ecosystems, human demographics and behavior, travel, industry, production of materials, economic policies, and of course, governance. Now, acknowledging this model, that there's a convergence of many factors which promote the emergence of infectious diseases, led Joshua Lederberg to suggest that what one needed was a paradigm shift in thinking about unraveling host-microbe relationships. And we should move away from a war against microbes and disease towards considerations of an ecological symbiosis. And indeed, most of us know that we live in close symbiosis with microbes. Microbes constitute a vast proportion of our own bodies. Their genes control us in many ways. And there's a symbiotic relationship between us and microbes, which we need to understand. He suggested that what we needed to develop was a germ's eye view. How do the germs see the host that they're in? And we have to understand that what we're looking at is using our wits against their genes. And this, again, is what we see in the development of the vaccines. Now, this gives me an opportunity to move to the idea of the paradigm shift. What I'm wanting to suggest to you now, that we're in an interregnum in the history of the world and in human history, where change is vital. We cannot continue to do what we did in the past with the idea that there will be linear progress into the future, that each problem can be addressed singly and in a silo, there's a solution found, and then the many little solutions will change us. It's clear that that's not working. So there are new ideas that are needed, and we need systems thinking, not linear thinking. We need to understand complex systems and how those interacting forces feed on each other, interacting with each other, can support or aggravate what's happening to us. So what we need to do is we need to re-examine the quest for health in the broadest context. And we need to focus, as I've said already, increasingly on the social determinants of health. Now, John Maynard Keynes, who, as you know, was responsible for the economic policies that enabled the world to be redeveloped and the social structures to be redeveloped in Europe after the Second World War, made a very important point. He said the difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas. There are plenty new ideas that we can have. The problem is escaping from the old ones. And that is our problem. We can't escape from the old ideas that seem to have worked but are no longer working. So if we're going to change the health paradigm to begin with, what do we have to do? Well, I think the model that we're working with at the moment is a model that's been called international health. It's something that applies to people internationally. And it's an individualistic model. It's focused on individual people. It's focused on the biomedical conception of health, with each problem being able to be resolved biomedically. What we need to move to, excuse me, is an ecological conception of health. To understand that our lives and our health are deeply entwined with each other across the globe and with the planet on which we live. But associated with that, we also have to have a change in the political paradigm. And this too is not new. Michael Maguire, in 2001, wrote this paper entitled Changing the Political Paradigm and What Was Wrong with the Paradigm that we were living in. And he suggested that there were changes needed in terms of our relationships, the way we conduct diplomacy, how power is used, and what we consider security to be based on. And I won't go through each of these issues because of time, but hopefully you'll be able to see them if this is recorded and you could come back to this presentation. What we need to change from is from competition to cooperation. Competition is a feature of the marketplace. Cooperation will be a feature of a new ecological conception of health, working together to achieve what needs to be achieved. And I remind you of the statement made by Virchow in 1847, I think it was, that medicine is a social science and politics is nothing but medicine writ large. If medicine is to be successful, it must enter political and social life. because diseases are caused by defects in society. And that, I think, will hopefully be clear from what I've said already. So what do we need to do to change the economic paradigm? Well, I think the first thing is we need to rethink the authenticity of excessively affluent lifestyles. The idea that 26 billionaires can own as much as 50% of the world is not something that we should be proud of, either that they are in that position or that the mechanisms are available for them to be able to do so. The key is going to be a new look at economic distribution. We're going to have something that resembles a much more accountable and effective regulation of the economy. And the whole concept of taxation, both national and international, will need to be re-examined. We also need to revitalize public infrastructure. The infrastructure that we have, our roads, our sewerage works, our water supply, electricity supply, all those issues that society critically depends on, they can't be privatized. They are public issues. They are social capital. And in many countries, including our own, the infrastructure has eroded. We need to pay much more attention to that infrastructure. And we need to improve what are called institutions of social reproduction. How do you reproduce the next group of educated people, the next group of health professionals? How do you reproduce healthcare institutions so that they get better and not worse, so they become less distorted, less dysfunctional, and more sustainable into the future? Those are the institutions that we work in and which need to be improved. And then we need to learn to value the contributions that are made to society by people who are not included in the GDP. I don't know if you know that all the work that people do that is unpaid, and in particular women's work in the home, caring for people, tending to the animals in rural areas or to the local things in their homes in the cities, none of that features in the GDP. It's an enormous contribution to the wealth of a country, but nobody measures it and we don't know about it. So we ignore it. It's out of sight and out of mind. So how are we going to do this? My suggestion is that we have to focus on reducing the environmental damage. That has to be the central point of any new change to the economic paradigm, reducing environmental damage. And I don't think we can do this without transdisciplinary research and collaboration on a broad scale. Now, we've seen this kind of transdisciplinary research undertaken, for example, for the HIV/AIDS vaccine. Money has been poured into that. People from all disciplines, all scientific disciplines have worked on that. And we don't have the AIDS vaccine yet, but in time, I'm sure we will. But there is no transdisciplinary research and collaboration across the social sciences and the humanities and geographers and political scientists and others who could look at the complex system within which we work and who would be able to develop some visionary alternatives to the system that we're currently living within. What we need to do is we need to work on developing sustainability. I won't tell you the difference today between sustainable development and developing sustainability, but many of you might understand that there is a difference, although I know it's contested and there's some who would like to argue with that notion, but we need to develop sustainability so that our planet can be sustainable into the future. There is a transition already towards renewable energy, and that is quite far advanced, and it's escalating, and it's becoming cheaper. And it's likely that there will be much more renewable energy available in the future. But the trouble is it will be insufficient and there won't be enough of it in time to handle what we need to do. So what we really need to do is we need to reduce energy consumption. And that's what we can begin to do today. And the motto for that will be doing better with less. So for example, there are many more ways, many less damaging ways to the environment of feeding people. If we ate vegetarian diets rather than heavily meat-based diets, the contribution to saving energy would be enormous. Look across any city in the world at night and you'll see lights lit all over the city that are wasting electricity that doesn't need to be done. The lighting of cities could be much less. Live in Canada for a few months as we do and you'll find that the houses are so hot in summer that you almost have to have a cooler in the house to cool it down. And in some of the houses are so cool that you need a jersey. The temperature control could be altered in a way that much energy could be saved, and there's much more that could be done. But doing better with less, I think, has to be the motto for the future. We mustn't imagine that we'll only do better if we have more. Now, looking at this complex issue, how are we going to achieve this? I want to make a suggestion that's deeply related to my own interests and my own work over recent years, and that is that all of these issues depend on relationships. How do we relate to each other? What is the ethical foundation? of the relationship between one person and another person, or between a person and the institution within which they work. I'm going to begin with the relationship to our environment, which is a changing landscape. We began many thousands of years ago learning to live with nature. We've moved to controlling nature. We've moved more recently into reinventing nature with genetic engineering. This has created new ecological niches from which infectious diseases can emerge. It's also leading to the potential for biological warfare. And that's happening at the same time where the geopolitical antagonisms are leading to the possibility of nuclear war and destruction. So our relationship with the environment is not moving in a positive direction. It's moving in a negative direction. Now, there are many other aspects of ethics. Interpersonal ethics is well developed. It's a solid discipline. We teach it at the medical school. There's an enormous literature and the ability to teach people how to interact with each other at the interpersonal level. We haven't yet developed an adequate institutional ethics that will determine how hospitals, how educational institutions should operate to bring out the best in those who work in those institutions. Public health ethics is another developing discipline, and that really only took off in 2003 after the SARS pandemic in Toronto, when the Canadians realized that they had no public health system or public health ethics on that. And more recently, we moved into the idea of a global health ethics and even the planetary ethics, the ethics of living within our ecological system. All of this requires education by cognate and competent teachers, but there are very little resources being put into educating people to understand all of these issues and to transmit them to pupils in schools, at university, and in working institutions. We seem to focus on the bottom line. We seem to focus on scientific advances, obtaining major grants, dealing with projects in silos. We don't understand our relationship to each other, our interdependence across the world. We have no conception of the theories and the ideas that have been proposed by many and that could enable us to lead better lives if we studied them and embedded them in our consciousness. So the climate is changing, but what about us? And this is another notice from the COP meeting recently. So we're back to the problem. We've got a confluence or a confluence or a collision or an interaction of all these different forces, and we're not coping. And the big question is, are we capable of learning from history to meet the challenges facing the whole of humanity? Well, Friedrich Hegel said no. He said the most important lesson we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. That's pretty depressing. But Jared Diamond is a bit more optimistic. He's written a book called Collapse and several other books. And he thinks that we can learn from the collapse of previous civilizations, and that there's a possibility that we can, in fact, learn from history. Bill Gates gives an almost unequivocal yes in his recent book, How to Prevent the Next Epidemic. He thinks that the developments of technology in the fourth industrial revolution, the new gizmos that will be designed, the potential even for perhaps altering the climate through interfering with the stratosphere will resolve the problems that we have. He's a strong believer in technological solutions. And Neil Ferguson, the well-known historian, who has written a book recently called Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, says, well, perhaps we can change the future. But he adds a caveat, and the caveat's important. And what he said was, it would be wonderful if the advance of science had liberated us from at least some of the irrational ways of thinking that characterized the ancient and medieval world. But and other ways of magical thinking have grown, even as religious belief has diminished. And the problem with magical thinking and truths that are not truths and an untrue world is the problem that we're also facing, and that's what we're dealing with the anti-vaxxers. So let's look, if we can, briefly, if I've got some time. 2 more minutes? 5 minutes, yeah. To the impediments to changing the paradigms. And I will just list these for you because there isn't time to talk about them much. The trajectory of history is too complicated for most people to understand. The dominant belief system and its power is invisible. The ideological fixation on free markets and associated with that, the denial and the deception, which Naomi Oreskes and others have written about in a book called Merchants of Doubt, and documents how the tobacco industry and the climate deniers have generated denial and deception. And then there are all these sorts of things that we face. Ursula Franklin, a distinguished feminist scientist in Canada, has expressed concern that the 7 cardinal sins that I've listed here are in danger of becoming the 7 cardinal virtues. And I've indicated how the moral compass has been limited to a narrow conception of human rights. So we have many difficulties communicating across cultures, across geopolitical differences. We have difficulty understanding that the higher education system has been eroded and is no longer committed to the open-minded pursuit of truth. There's a loss of trust in science. And of course, there are the failures of all those GOP meetings that have been held over 26 years. And again, Naomi Oreskes has written a wonderful book on why trust in science, which looks at the pros and cons of trusting in science. So are there any hopes for the future? I believe there are. First of all, we are now acknowledging that there may be a bleakness to the future that we hadn't admitted before. We've got an enormous capacity as human beings for empathy. We're beginning to understand the narratives of human retrogression as well as the narratives of progression. And we're developing some of the potential to feel that we are global citizens and can show some solidarity in the face of extinction. This requires that ambitious program that I told you about, which requires enormous amount of resources. And people say, but where are the resources going to come from? We haven't got resources. Well, the answer is to make peace and not war. Economic peace in the first instance. During the 2008 collapse, $17 trillion were found to bail out the banks in 3 months. And the IMF continues to give $5 trillion a year to the fossil fuel industry in subsidies. And if you look at the USA budget for next year, you'll see that 50% of the budget goes towards the military. And that is probably a source from which an enormous amount of resources could be channeled to much more useful purposes. Human ingenuity, if we applied that to social innovation as well as technological innovation, and the power of research and education as shown by the development of the various vaccines, including the COVID vaccine. So let me make a few final concluding remarks. What I want to say is that I've attempted today to relate a narrative of human progress and retrogression over the longue durée through the perspective of a humanly constructed world, a world system with confluences between the trajectories of environmental degradation, climate change, and infectious diseases, all complexly linked to the deleterious effects of unsustainable global political economy. While ongoing advances in science and technology will assist in making progress towards a better world, it has become essential to address the adverse upstream economic and social forces that are radically reshaping the viability of our planet and all its inhabitants. New paradigms of thought, harnessed to transdisciplinary research and education, could drive the kind of change that we need to see. A major challenge today is to fire the imagination and the efforts of the next generation who will follow careers in medical care and the practice of medicine for the benefit of individual patients and whole populations. 25 years of research in these issues, as I've discussed briefly today, are covered in 2 texts which were produced 10 years apart, which I co-edited with Julian Brock, a philosopher colleague in New Zealand. And these 2 texts offer detailed insights into many aspects of global and planetary health. And we hope that these texts provide at least some stimulation to thoughts for the future. They don't provide all the solutions, but they are thoughts over that period of time. And I'd like to end just by acknowledging the many people who stimulated my thoughts and cooperated with me during this time, and to express my apologies again for going a little over my time. I practiced this over and over again to keep it short, and somehow got to talking a little more than I thought I would. Thank you very much.
If we were at a 1980s anti-apartheid rally, we might have said, "Boa, Ntate, boa." Speak, elder, speak. And I have to say, Solly, thank you very much for that discourse that you've introduced us to and reaffirmed for many of us. I want to just raise 3 things that I will take out of this talk, amongst many others, but the 3 that I think influences this context of our faculty. It is this notion that our collective stories and histories are marked by epidemics and pandemics, which continually call us to rethink the disparities across our world. And so that for me is quite a powerful message. And then your reference to this idea of a global planetary organic crisis, calling us to reflect on the complex interactive systems manifested in how we understand health as the interaction between history, anthropology and sociology, biomedicine, the economics of our world, and as well as the environmental and ecological framing that you gave us. I'm challenged, though, by your sense of the tension that you displayed in the talk between neglect and denial. That weighed heavily on me, because for me, that tension is best reflected in the fact that wealth and privilege in our world is unable to see its connection with social disparity and neglect. And I think that that's something that we have to continually bring ourselves back to, is that we cannot speak, even as we speak today, in a sense of our own privilege. We cannot speak about changing the world without reflecting on the things we may have to give up as a privileged class. And that's often a thing we neglect. But I want to say to my colleagues in the faculty, and perhaps to all of you who speak from higher education institutions across the world, that perhaps as high institutions of higher education, we stand at that nexus between the problems with which we come into the room to the solutions that we offer our world, understanding our legacies and offering quite tangibly a different view of the future. And I think Solly has begun to do that in this talk this evening. So I'm really grateful for that. But as places where we learn and create new knowledge, we are best placed, in fact, to respond to these challenges that are presented. What will the health that UCT's Faculty of Health Sciences, what difference will we make in 10 years? Would it be perceptible? But colleagues, I really want to take on Solly's challenge of changing our paradigms. Can we seize this moment and change our paradigms of how we view the world, how we view each other, and how we engage in a new future? I'm inviting Marina Deacon to come up now and say a few words in relation to both the family's legacy and the contributions of the Fund and Ende legacy project within our faculty. Followed by that, Associate Professor Naledi will conclude this afternoon's proceedings. So I welcome Marina.
Thank you, Professor Green-Thompson. It's especially good to have Professor Benatar delivering the final Fund and Ende Memorial Lecture. Not only is he a friend and colleague of my eldest brother, but he also knew my mum personally, mainly because his wife was I was going to say an inmate, but that's not quite the right word, a student in the care of my mum at Baxter Hall residence. And I know that she kept a very watchful eye over all her students, and she had a fixation on the fact that her job description described her as being in loco parentis, and she took that very seriously. So I'm sure you got to know her pretty well. Thank you for an excellent lecture. It gave us all a lot of food for thought. I know that the Dean is considering how the medical faculty can react, and I took a couple of smaller things out of the lecture. I took the doing better with less as quite a poignant thing, and I was very pleased about the glimmers of hope, because we all need glimmers of hope at the moment. COVID-19 has certainly had a huge impact on many people's lives, especially in the last 2 years, and especially in the planning of this lecture, because it had to be postponed on 2 occasions. And finally, when we thought we had it together for this year, it was postponed again and put online, which is more or less why I'm standing up here instead of one of the more senior members of my family, as I'm the only one that's currently in South Africa and was able to attend. The reason that this is the last memorial lecture for my father is a family decision. My dad has been dead for more than 60 years. So at this stage at the medical school, there is not anyone who personally remembers him. And while my mum was alive, it was important for her to have the annual lecture, and I think she really appreciated it, and the admiration from the faculty for what my dad did in his time. But my mum died 5 or 6 years ago now, so there's not that urgency, and my siblings no longer live in the country. So we felt that perhaps the money that had been set aside for this annual lecture could be used more appropriately as a bursary for and I say a needy student, I mean a student that is a worthy recipient of an annual bursary to help them to study medicine. We thought that we could leave it to the university and the medical school to select the recipient and to manage the bursary, as it's sort of what you guys know how to do. And we felt that our dad would have thought that that was a good arrangement. We thank the Dean and Professor Naledi and Paul, I think, is the background girl and sent all the emails and did all the organizing for organizing this event. And we'll hope that you'll carry forward with the bursary. Thank you all for attending.
So I'm standing between you and carrying on with whatever it is that you need to do. So mine is just a vote of thanks. Firstly, to thank all of you that have joined us and have made the time to come and share this moment with us, who are joining us for online. To thank those who've made this day possible, and Marina has already alluded to Mpho Mokgotsi and her team, to Paul Rousseau, who's made the electronics work, and we haven't had too many issues. And to thank also Prof. Solly Benatar, and as a public health specialist and a health equity activist, your talk really resonated with me. And I really hope and pray that it will truly influence our faculty. It will influence what we value. It will influence what we research. It will influence what we teach. It will influence how we live our lives. It will influence how we do things. And in particular, what resonated with me is what you said about us being less competitive and us being more collaborative. And I think that speaks to us as individuals. It speaks to us also as a collective and as a community. So thank you very much also to your wonderful wife, Evelyn, that I had a pleasure to meet earlier on, for coming here today and for supporting you and allowing you to do what you do and for continuing to contribute into to society as you've been sharing with us earlier. Thank you very much, Marina and Jock, for coming all the way here and being with us here in person. We're excited that we're able at least to share it with you, even though we're not able to share it with your other siblings. And thank you to them for joining us here online. And thank you very much on behalf of the faculty, to your family, for really changing this lecture and making it to an anniversary for one of our students. On behalf of our faculty, we really thank you. And lastly, I really would like to thank Prof. van den Ende himself, as he is resting peacefully, and for really giving us as a faculty a gift that keeps on giving. And as our statesman, today seems to be the Day of Elders, so I thought I'll end with something from one of our most valued elders and statesmen, who's no longer with us also, Utatu Mandela. And he said, when a man has done what he considers to be his duty to his people and his country, he can rest in peace. And so may your wonderful dad, Prof. Van den Ende, rest in peace. And thank you so much for gift that keeps giving. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
What shall we do? What shall we do? What shall we do? What shall we do? Oh, Tony. What shall we do? What shall we do? Yeah, Tony. What shall we do? What shall we do? Jinga wata se urera rufumo mawako. Jinga wata se kuchengeta rufumo mawako. Vazwa babata pamuviri pasina rarabo. Vazwa patumbuka pamuviri pasina rarabo. Yeah, Toby, what shall we do? Things done. What shall we do? Oh, Toby, what shall we do? Things done. What shall we do? Yeah, Toby, what shall we do? Things done. What shall we do? What shall we do? Since what shall we do? Oh, Tony. What shall we do? Since what shall we do? Yeah, Tony. What shall we do? Since what shall we do? Jina wata se kupinywa newa ukere naye. Jina wata se kupinywa newa kabisa puma. Anjizima unamo utajuana. Ende ujizima unamo utajuana. Yeah, Tony, what shall we do? Since what shall we do? Oh, Tony, what shall we do? Since what shall we do? Yeah, Tony, what shall we do? Since what shall we do? buna matova rupita pererwa. Anoni by myself. Serive kuma buna mteuru mabota pererwa. Anoni by myself. Serive kuma buna mteuru mabota pererwa. Anoni by myself. Serive kuma buna matova rupita pererwa. Anoni by myself. Serive kuma buna mteuru mabota pererwa. Anoni by myself. Okay, let's sing. Let's all sing together now. Yeah, to be, what shall we do? Things there. I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Okay. Oh, to be, what shall we do? Things there. To be, what shall we do? Things there. One more time. Yeah, to be, what shall we do? Things there. What shall we do? Things are. What shall we do? Oh, to me. What shall we do? Things are. What shall we do? To me. What shall we do? Things are. What shall we do? Okay. You see, this time I'm talking to the youngsters. You know, each time you take this girl out, don't go indoors. I mean, taking out, don't go indoors. I'm sure you understand me. And if you do take that girl out, please take her back home in time.